Hello everyone, today we talk about the reign of Michael VIII Palaiologos as Roman Emperor from 1261 until his death in 1282. Michael VIII was the founder of the Palaiologan dynasty that would rule the Roman Empire until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Michael recovered Constantinople from the Latin Empire in 1261 and transformed the Empire of Nicaea into a restored Byzantine Empire, and his reign saw a considerable recovery of Byzantine power, including the enlargement of the army and the navy, and it would also include the reconstruction of Constantinople and the increase of its populations right through settlement. And also he re-established the University of Constantinople, which would lead to what is regarded as the Palaiologan Renaissance between the 13th and the 15th century. But in this period the Roman military interest shifted towards the Balkans, especially against the Bulgarians, leaving the Anatolian frontier relatively neglected. There is a debate on this, which kind of direction on the long run the renewed Byzantine power could have taken, right? Some say that theoretically at this point the Anatolia could be reconquered on the long run. It's not even completely devoid of foundation, but we're not going to discuss this, maybe on another occasion. Michael, in this regard, is considered as an energetic emperor, right? Especially consistent political mind, which, however, was not equated by the one of his successors, and this problems that, as you know, would rise during the 14th century. The Arsenate schism that actually had roots during in Michael's reign, but especially the Byzantine civil wars of 1321 and 1328 and 1341-47 will practically undermine, further force towards the territorial consolidation and recovery. Right, and especially draining the empire's strengths, economy, and resources. We will all see this in different videos. We will also observe in another video how Michael VIII actually rose to the throne, right? And after having blinded John IV Lascaris, right, and becoming unique sovereign in 1261. Right. And as we've seen, with Michael begins the most lasting dynasty of Constantinople. As you realize, the empire at this point was rebuilt fundamentally after the fall of Constantinople, and it presented an extension that was much inferior to the one before the Fourth Crusade. And even if many territories were lost during the agony of the Latin Empire, right, that had substituted Byzantine rule, many territories still remained into foreign control, right? For example, the Venetians held Coron, Modon, and Crete, plus some islands of the Hellenic archipelagos. Euboea was divided between the Venetians and the Frankish lords. Greece was under the Frankish domination, with Epirus and Thessaly that were held by an Hellenic government that was, however, not formally subdued to Constantinople. We made a video last month that is titled Medieval Greece that actually takes in consideration, besides the Byzantine Empire, all these other powers out there, kind of sketchy but structural ways. So if you're interested, you can check that out. It's in the Medieval Europe playlist. While the northern part of the Balkanic Peninsula was dominated by Serbia and Bulgaria, right? The territory which had widened at the expenses of Constantinople. Asia Minor, Endly, fell basically, at least the hinterland, under the Turkish domination. Right, the Byzantines, the Empire of Nicaea had Palaiologos had ruled from before reconquering Constantinople, was essentially this coastal stripe that of what was in fact historically Romanized, right, Hellenized, Romanized territory of Asia Minor. We also made a video about the Battle of Antioch on the Meander in 1211 that shows actually the Turkish potential to threaten the Nicene Empire. In fact, under Michael VIII, the same Meander Valley was a very important one because it was connected with the sea, and it was a fertile area, and with some urbanization was actually seized by the Turks. Right, so there is a very composite scenario here from a political point of view that is the one into which Michael VIII played very, very skillfully, using both arms and diplomacy, as we will see, and pursuing this policy of power, right, that was essentially looking towards the restoration of the empire in the territories that had already belonged to the Romans. And in the first years of reign, Michael VIII's policy was crowned by success. Right, in 1261 he obtained from the Prince of Achaia, William of Villers-Douane, in exchange for his freedom from prison, the oath of fealty and the restitution of the fortresses of Mistras, Monemvasia, Minas, and Hierarchion of the Peloponnese. Right, for the record, William of Villers-Douane had been captured at the Battle of Pelagonia. Was this great victory achieved by John in 1259, together with Alexis Strategopoulos and John Ducas, over basically was the Empire of Nicaea against the Despotate of Epirus, Principality of Achaia, so with the Duchy of Athens and one of the Archipelago, and the Triarchs of Negroponte, and even the Kingdom of Sicily. And this is what triggered this subjugation, say, in terms of at least recognition of fealty, that, as we will see, will be at some point even retracted, but still enough, because consider that, of course, these territories weren't permanently occupied, right? At least there was no capacity, aside from these strongholds that were recovered, the coastal areas, to make much of a headway garrisoning all the these broader territories, especially of the hinterland, right? So the deterrence could be mostly imposed with this new threat of invasion, and also considering the needs of trade, of production, right? These lands were naturally connected to Constantinople, to the broader traffics and infrastructures that the empire had in place at the time, always given that, as we have seen after the Fourth Crusade, great part of the Aegean had been taken over, especially by the Italians, but by the Venetians, right? The resurgency of the Palaiologos passed chiefly through the alliance with Genoa. There was Venetian primary rival on the sea, and that went on by subcontracting in turn all these various Aegean islands and more to the same Genoese from the side of the Palaiologos that were, of course, chronically short of money, like basically every other power there except the Italians, that were the only ones that achieved this, thanks to basically mostly occupying just trade points, right, and not expanding in the hinterland, right? But those were not properly empires as we could define them in terms of territorialization. Instead, these land powers had other specific goals, seizing the agricultural areas, etc., and building a more structured control of the hinterland, right? But at this point, it's fundamentally the Italian navies that dominate the seas, and as we will see, the Michael VIII was clever to exploit the rivalries within the Italians. That was basically the only way to make things leaning a bit better from one side, so this expansion, especially on the Achaean territories, brought to a further expansion towards the north, right, from the Peloponnese. Michael VIII also had fortune with his military expeditions against Bulgaria, right, that in 1262 was obliged to give up certain localities, among which the most important ports on the western coast of the Black Sea. The same success was met against Epirus, where victory that was achieved in 1264 by the Byzantine troops brought the local despot Michael II to recognize the imperial sovereignty. In all of this, considered that Michael was sowing very important alliances and international relations, the victory over Epirus was actually achieved thanks to Mongolian mercenaries that were sent from the Ilkhanate of Persia. There is all the story, by the way, of also the relations with the Sultan of Iconium, as Michael VIII, actually in the years before his reign, was obliged to flee in Iconium and serving the Muslims as an ally, as a pretendant to the throne. The local sultan eventually, when he instead was at the power of Constantinople, was overthrown. He had to flee because of Ilkhanate pressure, and Michael corresponded the hospitality because he didn't want to upset this Mongolian connection. It was very important, especially as we've seen for this military bonds. There were matrimonial ties actually here that were sealed, but there were also things that went wrong, right? Epirus Epirus was an important achievement. Michael managed to seize Durrës in today's Albania, and that area was particularly important because it was fundamentally invaded. It kept being invaded by the Sicilian rulers, right? In the first phase here before 1266, Sicily was under the control of Manfred of Hohenstaufen, the natural son of Frederick II, that had actually occupied Corfu and a part of the Albanian coast. And this is essentially what, since Norman times, the Sicilian rulers had wanted to do. As we'll see now, there's a big issue in Michael VIII's reign with the Angevins of Sicily, with Charles of Anjou, and this important re-expansion also of the Sicilian power after the Swabian, the late Swabian period was fundamentally a decadent one, or at least it was a less, prosperous situation that in previous times. But as we've said before, not everything went well, and especially the campaign started in Peloponnese after that the Prince of Achaia had rejected the formerly sworn oath of allegiance. That began with the Byzantine advance, but was concluded in 1264 with a scorching defeat in open field. And the balanced policy enacted by Michael VIII between Genoa and Venice prevented, furthermore, the predominion over one side or the other, right? One of the two republics, that definitely helped the empire overall. And up to 1265, Michael was allied of Genoa, as we've seen before, excluding Venice from the markets in the east. But eventually he was disappointed by the Genoese behavior that, of course, was no better than the Venetian one. They were essentially pursuing all the same practical goals, just from different political sides. And therefore, the Byzantine ruler broke the alliance with Genoa, and for a short time he attempted at least to grow closer to Venice, right? Remember that Venice had been the one that, together with the French, had basically destroyed the empire, the Fourth Crusade. But historically, the city had deep, relations, deep connections with Constantinople, her markets. The Byzantine navy had been, largely, in the last period, manned by the Venetians, that also, aside from the empire, were at the center of a major intercontinental trade, especially at this point. Right at this point, the Mongols are still keeping the corridor between Europe and China open, so that there is a massive trade flow between the two continents. And therefore, in 1265, there was this preliminary agreement, was not ratified, especially by Venice, actually. So much that by 1266, consequently, the alliance with Genoa was renewed, and in exchange of military aid, the Genoese obtained again the liberty of commerce, and also the Galata base on the Golden Horn that would become eventually this florid commercial city. Right, it was properly, a Genoese city. If you look at the Tower of Genoese in Istanbul today, that it's as far as I know, it's a restaurant now. But you understand what it means. Like that, if you compare the typical Genoese streets in Genoa, Italy, and with the Galata quarter, you see the striking analogies. These were really and literally cities within cities, right, where the Italians entrenched themselves in. They had their own garrisons, their own fortifications, and they were very difficult to dislodge. So at this point, the empire was helpless in the sense that they couldn't do without these elements. Not much because, in military terms, but if not at sea, which is a big deal, but that's exactly the point. The main point was the trade accessibility. The fact that the Byzantine society at this point was not economically competitive compared to the Western European one. So much that they needed to essentially to co-participate these systems to draw money from it. And this was actually the same exact things for basically every power that controlled the Mediterranean coasts. They couldn't do without this merchant that were quite unruly by the quarrel that they fought against each other continuously. Sometimes entire cities went destroyed as a process because they brought their own rivalries within these territories. But you could kick them out for a while, but eventually your finances would start to go down. So that was a huge deal. It was not much of an option to recall. And the conclusion of the agreement with Genoa, as you can imagine, triggered once again the jealousies of Venice, that in spite of the defeat suffered in 1261, right, because after the recovery of Constantinople, actually there had, important, as we've seen, important coastal centers had been recovered by the Byzantines. The city was practical, was pragmatic, right? Their governments were actually pretty smart in this way, and albeit they, of course, loathed the Byzantines, they still came closer to them in order not to lose important positions to the advantage of Genoa, right? And therefore, as a consequence, it was concluded a new treaty in 1268 between the Byzantines and the Venetians that established a 5-year truce, right? And Michael VIII granted certain facilitations for the Venetian trade. And as we were hinting at before, important changes occurred in the meanwhile in the Italian peninsula, putting a strong limitation on the expansionistic projects of Michael VIII. So, as we were saying before, the elimination of the Swabian domination in southern Italy in 1266 with the Battle of Benevent, right, and the rise on the throne of Sicily of Charles of Anjou, that was brother of King of France, Louis IX, therefore, extending here not just his own personal power as Count of Provence, but really, extending French rule now from the Channel, literally to Sicily and to all these various, extending this protectorate, let's say, on these various essentially French principates in Greece, brought a new impulse to the traditionally Sicilian expansionistic plans, to the detriment of Constantinople. Right, that had been a constant, as we were saying before. The Normans did that. The Swabians didn't do excessively much, but because they were busy doing other stuff. But they still orientatively wanted and needed to seize Constantinople and reunite East and West. The Angevins do the same. The Angevins see, as we'll see now, will have a pretty sound maritime, strategical thinking, right? Even after the loss of Sicily, we'll see later with the Vespers, they will essentially keep trying to reunite those lands in a eminently maritime fashion, right? The Angevins do not expand in central northern Italy, for example. They don't try to break this connection between France and the Italian peninsula. They mostly want to expand in Mediterranean, which is obvious, right? In any from any side you want to see that. I would say it's a tendency for powers in northern central Italy to expand towards the south, right? Which is what everybody was doing at that point. The Germans, the Pope, right? So anybody who had this broader imperialistic ambitions, while the Mediterranean at this point was literally booming in economical terms, in trade flows was utterly amazing, and the whole deal was to extend the control on this major routes that shifted this immense amount of goods and wealth between Europe and the East, and also it's as if this would require long digression, considering the balance of the needs of local government in the Sicilian kingdom that had some important problems that were related to the late Swabian period, and also the means through which the Angevins had seized the control of the same. Especially the barons had increased their power. I mean, there was all a negotiation in this regard, and this Mediterranean policy, right? And actually, I think the Angevins were quite clever. They did very, very well. The point is that they were surrounded themselves by enemies. Right now, making a Byzantine history video, of course, we see it from the Byzantine side of the story. These struggles in their own kind with neighbors everywhere. But the situation for the Angevins in southern Italy was basically the same. It was not that easy, but the impression we get, at least historiographically speaking, is that in this first phase, the Angevins kind of overexploited the situation in southern Italy. I don't know personally, because I'm not an expert on the topic, but there is indeed a big vision, a big plan. Charles of Anjou is one of the greatest rulers in medieval history. He definitely had a grand vision. He was actually at some point the most powerful person in the West, especially after his brother's death, extending his control, his influence on his nephew in France. So there was as we were saying before, this broader French Guelph papal alliance in Europe that at this point was really looking very, very far away, right? Because the Angevins were rising on many, many thrones all over Europe, and there is a general, complication here that we cannot reduce just to, Sicily and the Byzantine Empire. But it's evident, however, and clearly that Charles of Anjou was intentioned, paradigmatically, unavoidably, to conquer the Byzantine Empire, right? And he ensured, naturally, the papal support in the sense that, naturally, the fall of Constantinople into Palaiologan hands had been a heavy blow to the papal, to the universality of papal rule, right? As the Greeks now regained proper autonomy over their decision to have an independent church, and in force of diplomatic agreements that basically brought the Angevins as allies of the deposed Latin sovereign, the heirs of the Latin Empire. Charles claimed basically for himself the right to the sovereignty over Constantinople, initiating at the same time the preparations for large military expeditions, right? And at this point, Michael VIII really didn't have the necessary forces to contrast the Angevins, and therefore he tried to belate the expeditions and in parallel to play the diplomatic card of the religious union with Rome. Right, this is something that the Byzantine, the Palaiologos at this point, up to the end of the empire, will actually do on multiple occasions to try to seek aid from the West in general in many circumstances. But he realized now that if he had open to the possibility of reuniting the two churches, the papacy would have thought twice about backing the Angevins to wipe out the Byzantines, and this naturally would have helped so many levels, because there was naturally an imposing papal propaganda all over the Latin Christendom to justify the attacks to the schismatic Constantinople. Right, consider that the medieval political propaganda was overwhelmingly sophisticated, radically advanced. I mean, much of even prejudices we have today, stereotypes over medieval history, are actually our minds still being manipulated by medieval political propaganda. And it was so effective that we still reason in their terms and misunderstanding the reality, as they instead understood it pretty damn well and much better than us. And Michael VIII's diplomacy convinced also the King of France, Louis IX, to bring with himself Charles in the Crusade of Tunis of 1270, right? And the year after were also started the contacts with Rome, right, that were rendered possible, by the way, also by the election of the Italian Pope Gregory X, that was well disposed towards Constantinople, and at the same time Angevin policy. At this point, the papacy was rising once again to power, especially in Italy, because in a few years, the same year of the Council of Lyon, we will see in a while, he actually gained the control over this area of northern Italy, that is Romagna, that the Holy Roman Emperors had always essentially contended to the church, having the upper hand. Meanwhile, Rudolf of Habsburg, in order to be legitimized on the Austrian throne, had won the alliance through the Pope, granted now these territories, important cities like Ravenna, Bologna, for example, to the papacy that now extends across the Apennines and controls these regions that historically had always tried essentially to seize. So here the Gregory X is comes after the series of French popes that had consistently backed the anti-imperial, anti-German policy in Italy, so much that now when the Angevins have conquered Sicily and basically have replicated the scenario that, from the papal side, so with, surrounded by a continental power plus Sicily that was just next door, brings the fellow French to slow down and say, okay, now, we've done all this thing to kick the Swabians out. By the way, in 1268, you surely know it, Conradin of Hohenstaufen, the last heir of the Hohenstaufen, had made these expeditions in Italy, had arrived in the papal territory. The Pope had to flee and had basically defeated the Angevins at the Battle of Palaiologos. That eventually, the Angevins had set up an ambush. Charles of Anjou managed to basically defeat him in turn and capture him and behead him on the Market Square of Naples. By the way, it was the papacy mostly that wanted the Hohenstaufens out of there and wanted the beheading. Charles of Anjou said, but this is kind of not of a chivalric, honorable thing. We are going to behead the 16 years old. And that was even practically right, aside from the fact, of the accusers of heresy that had become paradigmatic for the Hohenstaufen in the anti-German policy of the papacy. And therefore now the Gregory X kind of slowed down a little bit. The thing allowed Rudolf of Habsburg now to found a nucleus of a revival of imperial power. Never became emperor, but what we're talking about is king of the Romans in a Ghibelline sense, defeating, by the way, Ottokar II of Bohemia was Charles of Anjou ally. Right, the Battle of Markfeld, that's where he got Austria in the first place. In fact, Michael VIII was seeking aid in this context against the Angevins, even talking with Rudolf of Habsburg, that however didn't have much to send to him in that context. But this is the general picture that makes us reconsider why now the papacy was favorable to slow down Angevin expansion, right? Albeit now the papacy was basically framed within the French Guelph alliance and would remain, right, for a long time. Think about Boniface VIII or Philip IV will at the end of the century they will argue, excommunicate each other, all these things, but they were the France and the papacy would and Sicily under the Angevins would stay unavoidably together for generations. But anyhow, the Byzantine papal negotiations ended well. In 1274 was summoned a council at Lyon where the disagreements between the two churches was formally at least recomposed with the proclamation of the religious union, and the Byzantine delegates swore to accept the Roman faith and even the Roman primacy. Right, and the political advantages were immediate. Charles of Anjou had to give up his plans of conquest, right? So Constantinople was safe. Michael VIII could, at this point, launch actually a counteroffensive on various fronts as a consequence. The Union had, however, harsh aftershocks in the internal policy of the empire, as the clergy, the monks, and great part of the population were completely opposed to the religious reunion, and they basically pushed Michael VIII to enact very harsh persecutions of dissent. Right, and the ecclesiastical faction that was against the union found expressions in the movement of the Arsenites. They were so called because from the Patriarch of Constantinople, Arsenius, that had been deposed in 1266 by the same Michael VIII, that opposed harshly the imperial policy. And in fact, the union didn't last even in the West, right? And with the rise to the papal throne in 1281 of the French Martin IV, that was basically a pawn of Charles of Anjou, there was again a new break, as the Pope condemned Michael VIII as schismatic, and also Charles of Anjou, that already in 1280 had attacked fruitlessly imperial Albania, could resume his plans of conquest by promoting an anti-Byzantine coalition was formed by the heir of the Latin throne, Philip of Courtenay, right, plus Venice, Thessaly, that by 1271 had split from Epirus, and Serbia and Bulgaria. So this is this major alliance set in motion by the papacy and the French that bring all the Balkanic enemies of the empire against Michael. And the Serbs and the despot of Thessaly, in fact, broke into Macedonia in 1282, and Charles of Anjou, with the naval help of Venice, essentially prepared himself to give the final blow to the empire. But the situation was saved at the last moment by one of the most important events in medieval history, were the Sicilian Vespers, this revolt that broke out in Palermo and then eventually, expanded. Actually, was really planned since a while. We don't know excessively much about it, but this broke out in March 1282, right? And here was basically an uprising organized by Byzantine diplomacy, right? As the Michael VIII basically paid an important amount of money to the Aragonese, that as Peter of Aragon basically had married the daughter of Manfred of Hohenstaufen, and he claimed the Sicilian inheritance for himself, right? Given that in feudal line, at least this is what the thing should have been, and as Manfred was excommunicated, but not his wife, but this was just the formal clothing of the thing. What actually happened is that the Aragonese landed in Sicily, right, and therefore the Angevin control of the island soon faded, and it brought to this extremely violent conflict, right, this series of wars actually that lasted until 1302, 20 years, which Sicily was basically destroyed, right? It was already declining since the last decades, but now it fundamentally really changed. It became center. The Angevins were ruling from Naples, as you know, so they had already shifted the capital in another dimension. But what happened is that the Kingdom of Sicily remained split in two. In fact, both sovereigns called their own half of the kingdom as Kingdom of Sicily. Even Naples was known as such because they wanted to both collect the legacy of the unitary kingdom. And this fracture was very important because definitely it halved the Angevin power. In southern Italy, it brought to this continuous threat to the coast, to trade, right? This is where, of course, the Italian maritime republics start, swimming into quite happily. In many ways, the situation gets overcomplicated. There will be the great crisis of the 14th century. So now, let's not push forward with what the situation triggered, but it's important to stress the fact that without the Sicilian Vespers, the Byzantine Empire might have actually been wiped out at that point. As the Angevins at this point aborted every project of expedition in the east, and they spent an enormous amount of resources in attempting to recover Sicily, with Naples was the strongest side at this point. So the Angevins spent an enormous amount of money in building, hiring fleets and assembling armies and trying repeatedly these invasions of Sicily that lasted for basically up to the 40s and beyond. Actually, it was something of the 14th century. And it basically bled probably the Neapolitan sources white in this case, and it freed the Byzantine Empire from further attacks from that area. There was at that point a much better structured asset, if it hadn't been for the revolt, and that would have probably achieved already by the end of the 13th century the reconquest of Constantinople. And in all this, we've mentioned the Venetians in the anti-Byzantine coalition, right? And this position had been motivated by the fear of the expansionistic aims of Michael VIII, Palaiologos, to the detriment of the Republic. And the coming closer of the 1268 was confirmed actually by a new treaty of 2 years duration, hadn't stopped the imperial projects of reconquest that were aimed especially towards the Venetian islands of the Aegean Sea. Right, and towards the summer of 1277, the Byzantines started a wide counteroffensive commanded by Licario, that was an Italian pirate at the service of Constantinople, that brought to the submission of numerous lesser islands chiefly, and this offensive would be followed in 1280 by the attack on Eubea, that fell in great part under the control of the Byzantines, in spite of a strenuous resistance of the Venetians and of their Latin allies. This context is important because the Mediterranean at this point is rising as a very uncontrollable system. Right, the kinetic energy. We made a video recently about exactly this period and seeing how difficult it actually became to even control just certain routes. Here, the Venetians and the Genoese were, as we have seen, the protagonists, but there were many other actors. Sometimes, even think about Lauria, basically the greatest admiral of the Middle Ages. Or even about the adventure of the Catalan company, we will see in another video, and how it, basically starting from nothing, from business, piracy, all this stuff they did, Roger de Flor put up this company that created an empire across Europe and Asia, right? And it was a moment of unpredictability in many ways, and that's where also the Byzantines in the following decades didn't have the unity of the intents to actually maintain sound control, and were worn out even by all this pressure, and its adversaries took advantage of the same. But the fact that the instability, this is an unstable system. This is an area that we have seen before, especially in the medieval Greece video, as a fragmented system, right? Doesn't matter that the Palaiologos had reconquered Constantinople, largely the territories of Greece and surrounding areas were very permeable, right? And the empire also didn't have the same strength as before, so controlling them was, especially the periphery, was complicated. Naturally, Constantinople maintained a centrality because it was a huge city, right? It was, as we know, well fortified in this important strategic location, and also with more than one option actually of expansion. But in front of this situation, the Venetian government naturally refused to renew the Treaty of 1277, and he sought help to the Anjou, right? With whom in 1281 was concluded in Orvieto in central Italy a treaty that committed the two sides to concur militarily to the crusade against Constantinople in order to settle on its throne the heir of the Latin Empire, Philip of Courtenay, and therefore restoring at the same time to Venice all the rights that it had enjoyed under the Latin Empire. As we were saying before, the Latin Empire was this big, kind of terrestrial power, right? And while Venice had just controlled the Vajor sports, even if, by the right of conquest, the agreements before the fall of Constantinople, technically the Venetians could even ask for 1/3 or 1/4 area of the land of the empire. They said, we just want the ports. That was objectively what they were only interested in. Now, the Venetian-Angevin alliance is fascinating because usually Venice had been allied with basically whichever power that didn't threaten to choke the Adriatic, the Strait of Otranto passage, right? So usually Sicily had been stronger in the context, in previous contexts, so they mostly stuck with the Byzantines against whoever ruling there. At this point, instead, the situation is more balanced because Sicily is split in two. As we have seen, the Byzantines managed to recover even Epirus, Albania. So now Venice was, more operating towards the in fact, properly the Angevins in this case, rulers. And so this situation deteriorated as we have seen, especially after the Sicilian pest. On the long run, however, and chiefly thanks to the prominence on the sea and the gradual decline, especially of the Byzantine and Angevin navies, brought Venice to rather confront there the Genoese and to reapproach Constantinople after all, because the Venetians, as we've seen also recently in that video, trade conflict, I don't remember what it was called, in Mediterranean, didn't have much of an interest in the Western Mediterranean. Yeah, they had some bases here and there, but that was mostly Genoese territory, eventually Aragonese, also because they used the Aragonese in anti-Genoese function in the West, and to grow closer once again instead with Constantinople, which happened with the agreement of 1285, right, where another treaty was agreed, as naturally, what Venice was mostly interested in and was dominated were the trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, where all the Silk Road goods passed through. So that's basically what brought Venice once again to stick with the Byzantines. So yeah, we will see on another occasion. So enough about Michael VIII reign for today. We will definitely make another video about him because he's really one fascinating figure. This is just part of a manualistic approach to the subject, and we mostly talk about the various, not about the ruler, but the rule, right? The reign proper. But Michael had an interesting life. Also, initially speaking, he had there's contrasts with the previous emperors, etc. He did his service even in Iconium, etc. But this was not part of the thing. The most important thing here is to realize that this game, with what happened with Angevin Sicily, that is what literally risked Constantinople to be seized once again by the Latins. Okay, so we will continue hopefully this series about Byzantine history on another occasion. We go random, we don't go in chronological order, so I don't know what will come next. So for now, I just thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Also, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And I thank you heartily again. And I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.